Okay, so we have one more talk before we take a coffee break and stretch our legs. The next speaker is Nigel Stork. He is the head of the Department of Resource Management and Geography at the University of Melbourne. Many of us have known Nigel over the years from his work largely in insect biodiversity, and he used to be at the Natural History Museum in London for many years, and then was the CEO of what was known as the Rainforest CRC in Northern Australia. So his talk today is about extinction proneness among different groups of organisms. Are we really losing 100 species a day? Are we? All right, Nigel.
Thank you, Christian. You better just help me get my... Well, g'day, everyone, as they say. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have to say, I'm really delighted to be involved in this debate. I remember about 15 years ago when I started to give... my slide's on that one. Yeah, it's on that one, yeah. To give my thoughts on this, and I was told by one eminent scientist that I shouldn't be giving these kinds of comments because I was talking against conservation. And so I really relish this approach that Bill and Joe have taken of really having a full discussion about the issues that are involved here. I'd also like to say that, believe it or not, there are rainforests in Australia. And Australian rainforests suffer many of the same problems that they do around the world. We've just put together a book which is published by Wiley Blackwell's, which I think is probably the most comprehensive book on looking at issues to do with Australian tropical rainforests. It's called Living in a Dynamic Tropical Forest Landscape. Okay. Okay, thanks very much. So the question that I posed here today is, are we really losing 100 species a day? And if not, why not? And I come from this with the perspective of being an insect biologist. And a few years ago, I was looking at a Time magazine article, which was a really great article. It was talking about primate conservation. But in the sort of byline at the top, it said, as far as we know, no primate became extinct during the 20th century. That's an impressive record since the world loses about 100 species a day. Now, I didn't know where that quote of 100 species a day had come from, so I thought I'd really take it up. When something's published like that in Time, it reaches a very wide audience, and people will take that sort of thing as gospel. So if you look back in time, and it was very interesting to be around at the beginning of this kind of debate and to see what was going on, the biodiversity crisis really was brought to prominence by a number of very key and eminent scientists who did some wonderful work. And to me, three major issues really brought that issue to prominence. One was the work of Norman Myers, who identified the massive tropical forest loss around the world. Quite extraordinary work from Norman. And then, secondly, a number of people who, Tom Lovejoy, who's here today, I think, and Paul Ehrlich, Peter Raven, and others, who basically said, well, look, if we are losing this area of forests, then if we use that species-area relationship, which you've heard about today, then we're potentially losing a very large number of species. Now, added to that, until about the early 1980s, we thought we were probably around a couple of million species on Earth. And then a guy called Terry Irwin, who's from the Natural History Museum in here, was working in tropical forests in Panama and Brazil and was using insecticides to knock insects out of trees. Discovered a very large numbers of species in the trees. And then he was asked by someone, well, if there are so many species in the trees, just how many species of insects are there in the world? And he set a calculation together where he said, well, if there's this number of species on this particular tree, and if we say 13% of those are specific to that tree, there are 50,000 tree species in the world, you multiply that up, And then if you add the things that are not only found in the canopy but are found on the ground, then you end up with 30 million species of insects on Earth. So with this forest loss that people were talking about, people suddenly thought, well, we're going to be losing millions and millions of species. And this is one of the quotes, typical quote from that time. Earth's biodiversity is being overtaken by a mass extinction which, if allowed to proceed unchecked, could well eliminate between 1/4 and 1/2 of all species. That was by Norman Myers. And look, here is a table that I and others put together at the time. I don't suppose you can read it all, but the first column is really the estimate of the sort of loss that people were talking about. The second one was in terms of percentage global loss per decade. And then the third column is a method of estimation. Just a second. I'm suffering from dehydration and jet lag. Now, if we actually, some of these estimates, we're talking about 30%, up to 30% loss of species per decade. And so this is 25 to 30 years ago. Well, if they were right, we should have seen the loss of at least half of all species on Earth. And in fact, we haven't seen that. And there are reasons for that, some of which have been discussed earlier on so far. But when you think about it, to a nearest approximation, all species on Earth are insects. There are millions of them. And of course, this is the sort of thing that a non-entomologist would think of as an insect, these beautiful, large, glossy things. This is a lovely drawer from the Natural History Museum in London, and it's all the big, showy things. But in practice, most of them are like this. Now, you can see the pin heads on those pins, and then you see going down the pin, there's a little white card, and stuck, glued on the end, very badly glued by me, are some little tiny beetles. This happens to be Staphylinid species number 57. Where's it from? From Australia. About 25 years ago, I was working with Terry Irwin, but I was working in Borneo, he was working in Panama. I was also using canopy fogging like this. And to give you an idea of just how many species of insects there are, I was using this fogging technique and fogging some large trees in Borneo, putting plastic sheets on the ground. I fogged 10 trees, and I had 20 square meters of plastic sheet under each tree. We fogged the tree, the insect rain would come down, you collect it up with some brushes, and you put them in a pot. Well, I was very disappointed because from those 10 trees at 200 square meters of plastic sheeting, I probably had about half a bottle of insects, that's all. What a waste of time going all there. Anyway, I took them back to the museum in London, and my colleagues and I then sorted the 25,000 insects that were in that bottle to 5,000 species. Some of those trees, some of those plastic sheets, there were over 1,400 species on a single sheet. So don't get the wrong, people have the wrong impression about insects. And most organisms are very small. So this is a pie chart. It's really from about 20 years ago, but it hasn't changed very much in terms of the proportions that we've actually described of species. You'll see that over a half, the bottom green area are the insects, okay? About a quarter of all described species on Earth are beetles, and you can guess which group I work on. So most organisms, therefore, are insects. The vertebrates here represent about 2.7% of those described species. Now, if Terry Irwin was right, of course, then the vertebrates would only be less than sort of 0.1% of all the organisms. Then we have things like fungi as well, and again, we don't know how many species there are of those. Some suggest perhaps up to 1 million species. We really don't know. The other thing about these organisms is that they play extraordinary vital roles in the way that our ecosystems function. And I'd give you an example from Australia as to how important these things are. You've probably seen these big hats that people wear with corks hanging down. You can buy them in shops in Australia. Well, people needed those 30, 40 years ago because the landscape was getting covered by cow pats, by dung, cow dung. Because the cattle are not native to Australia, there were no native organisms to break down cow dung. And thousands and thousands of hectares of land were getting covered in cow dung, which instead of breaking down in 3 months as it does here, it takes 7 years in Australia. And then there were lots of flies. So if we don't have these kinds of organisms, then we don't get the natural processes occurring. I just throw this in for particularly the people who might know a little bit more about this, but one of the problems with such estimates is someone saying, well, I think there's 30 million species on Earth, and other people are saying 100 million, is you don't know how much certainty there is to those kinds of estimates. And this is some work that a number of us are working on at the moment, where we're trying to provide some sort of better certainty on those estimates. And we put a lot of data into this, into a mathematical model. And what this chart is at the top, I've done one for beetles at the top, another one for butterflies and moths, is the probability of the number of species on Earth and a number of species of these organisms on Earth. Where am I here? Not seem to work. So down. So there's the number of tropical arthropod species, 30 million up here. You can see a very, very low probability of that being the case. And the likelihood is that we are talking somewhere around 3 to 5 million species of insects on Earth. The other little chart that I've done here is to show whereabouts in the calculation is the greatest level of uncertainty. So we're just about to publish that work in the next few months. So I did say in my abstract that I'd talk about what traits make species more extinction prone. To some extent this is pretty well known for organisms, but it does vary from one group to another. In general, large body size makes species often more extinction prone, particularly ones with small ranges. And when they're restricted ranges, in other words, they're on the top of a mountain or they're on an island, they're even more likely to be extinction prone. Things that have low fecundity, in other words, they produce very few young and they're very slow to produce young, are also more prone. Things that are of a higher trophic level, in other words, things at the top of the predator chain, at the top of the food chain, are more likely to, or actually are dependent on another organism, are also likely to be more extinction prone. And then those things that have a very low physiological or behavioral adaptability are also very extinction prone. So now I want to move on to extinctions then over geological time, just to give you a bit of a framework of what we know about the past. And I'm not a specialist in this area. I mean, there are people who work in this museum who probably know far more than I would know about this. But you'll see on this bottom graph here that if you, at the left-hand side is the current period here, where we are now, and on the right is 540 million years ago. And you can see that over the period of time, the numbers of organisms, different kinds of organisms on Earth, is probably higher now than it ever has been at any other time. But we know that there's been these mass extinction events which have occurred in the marine environment when there's been massive crashes of those organisms. And we know that because these things have been very well fossilized, and there were sudden crashes in the number of those things. We know less about things where there are there's a low ability to preserve them as fossils. But that's a bit of a background. And it's been estimated that at least 96% of extinctions have occurred outside those mass extinction events. Often people think, oh, those mass extinction events wiped out most of biodiversity on Earth, but in practice, I think that 96% is probably an underestimate, and there's probably been a lot more extinctions that we just don't know about. Another phenomenon which is interesting is that when you, this is some data here collected by a range of people, but different kinds of organisms appear to have different lifespans as species on Earth. And if you look at the bottom, the mammals on average have a 1.1 to 2 million million years lifespan compared to the invertebrates, which seem to have a much longer lifespan. Now, to me, I have to say this data I think is fairly flaky, but I think that it probably needs to be more work done on that for it to be convincing. So I want to talk now a little bit more about the present, and that is that, and about global extinctions, and well, certainly in the last few hundred thousand years, and certainly maybe in the last 2 to 3 million years since the advent of hominids. And during that period, we've seen half the world's megafauna, these are species of larger than 45 kilos, have gone extinct, particularly in Australia, Eurasia, Americas, and Madagascar. Also, over the last 1,000 years, there's been massive loss of these wingless birds, the ratites, and particularly on the Pacific and other oceanic islands. And those were really occurred when man first moved onto those islands, possibly 750 to 1,000 years ago. When you look at something like the amphibians in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a very large loss of amphibian species, but this is largely due to disease, particularly chytrid fungus and other kinds of diseases as well. And there's some implications that some of these species are also being lost through climate change. But overall, about 300 species of vertebrates are recorded as globally extinct in the last century, 0.4% of vertebrates. And this equates to about 50 extinctions per million species years, compared to what we think of the background rate of 1 extinction per million species years. So if you look at the extinctions of birds, and this is from some data by Groombridge, you'll see that most of these extinctions have actually taken place on the islands. This is actually an underestimate because it doesn't have a lot of those ratite birds included in there. Some of those bars should be much higher than they are. And in fact, birds have been particularly well studied. And as I said, if there's a background rate of 1 species extinction per million species year, as we think, over the geological past, Stuart Pym and others have looked at the birds, and since 1600, probably about 1.3% of birds have gone extinct, and that's equivalent to 26 extinctions per million species years. But he thinks, and he and his colleagues think, that there are a number of factors which probably have increased that rate, and therefore if it's corrected for those factors, it probably is up to around about 100 extinctions per million species years. And they think with climate change and other major threats that we're actually looking at extinction rate by the end of the 21st century of 1,000 extinctions per million species years. But they did recognize in this paper that birds may well not be good predictors for other organisms. And I think that's one of the key points that I really want to make. We can't be certain that what we know about some of these very well-known groups can be transferred to others. Similarly, if you look at analysis of the threats to birds and mammals, and this is some data here for mammals in the dark histogram bars, and the grey one is for birds, and this is for Australasia and the Americas, we see that habitat destruction, hunting, and introduced species are the major causes of the decline of these species. So let's move then to the insects. And this is a recent phylogeny for the beetles. This is done by a group of colleagues at the Natural History Museum and and elsewhere in London. And this shows the massive diversification of the insects, of the beetles, in the last 250 million years. And I haven't got it here, so okay, I'll leave it. But this extraordinary diversification, just to give you an idea of how diverse they are, there's probably 150 families of beetles that we recognize, and quite possibly we could be looking at 1 to 2 million species of beetles. In this museum, I guess there will probably be about 10 taxonomists who will tackle a family each in terms of the taxonomy of those groups. So for the other 40 families, there aren't experts in those particular families. These are very diverse and very complex groups. But they appear to show very high survival rates of those lineages. And this is, I think, very typical of insects in general. And these red arrow bars here show when the last 3 mass extinction events, which admittedly were marine events, when they took place. And there doesn't seem to be a major hiccup in the evolution of the beetles at those particular periods in time. So what's happened? What about global extinctions of species? Well, we have far, far less data on the extinction of insects, and this is a similar chart here for the extinctions. It was 66 species, I think it's now 65. This largest species, which is the Lord Howe Island stick insect, which was thought to have gone extinct off the coast of Australia, has since been rediscovered in the last half dozen years. It's very difficult to actually determine when a species has gone extinct. We know very, very much less about the insects. But again, if you start to look at the threats to those, and I've actually here resorted to looking at the British beetles, British insects, since they're so well known. And here I put down just 3 of those, just 3 families of beetles and what we know about the threats to them. It doesn't really matter particularly that you can't read what the actual individual threats are, but if you look to see, for each of those 3 families, there's a different set of suite of threats that are causing the decline of some of those species in the UK. And I could put up another 10 or 15 families, and they'd each have a different suite of threats to them, which means that you can't necessarily just take any one of these families and study those and think you're going to be summarizing what's happened to the insects in British Isles. Now, about 15 years ago, some scientists thought that they could work out just about the decline of species and extinction rates from looking at how our records of species and their threat was changing over a period of time. And I won't go into the details of this, but basically they found that there were major differences between different families in the relative rates of extinction for those particular families. So that the palms, they thought 50% of the palm species could go extinct in the next 70 years. For birds, 50% in the next 350 years. And mammals, 50% in 250 years. Now, they obviously couldn't do anything about the insects because they don't have any data for those kinds of things. Just not enough information. But again, what I did was to look at the British information, and we know these insects and other organisms extremely well in the UK. And we found that in general, that there was something like a 7 times greater chance of a mammal or bird to go extinct in the UK than an insect or a spider or a mollusk. And I'm not going to go into details there, but so what we did was to see if we can back test this to see if this is probably true or not. So of 1,300 species of British insects, in other words, 0.7% of those have not been seen since 1900. This relative extinction rate of 7.1 will predict that 11 bird species should have disappeared from the British Islands. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. 11 species have gone. So what does that really mean for global extinction rate, insect extinction rates? Well, we know that 1% of birds and mammals are extinct, at least 1% is extinct since 1600. And that suggests if we use this 7.1 ratio for the insects, then only 0.14% of the insect species should have gone extinct as well. If we assume this is 8 million, this is just a figure I plucked out of the air, then approximately 11 to 24,000 species have gone extinct since the year 1600. And even if all of those have been lost in the last 50 years, then that's equivalent to 5 to 10 a week, not 100 a day. And so I have to question this business of 100 species a day going extinct. I'll come back to that in a minute. Smith and others, I showed you before, suggested that there's going to be something like a 12 to 55 increase in the extinction rates for birds and mammals over the next 300 years. Well, that relative extinction rate would suggest something like 1.7 to 7.7% extinctions over the next 300 years. And that's equivalent to 100 to 500,000 insect species. Now, again, this is very speculative, but it just shows that there are some major differences in people's approaches. Another thing I wanted to mention then is the business about coextinction. And a few years ago, I was working with a colleague of mine who works on lice. And he mentioned about these two species of lice that had disappeared when the passenger pigeon, last passenger pigeon, died. In fact, they've got the names Columbicola extincta is one of them. So it was described after the passenger pigeon had gone extinct. And that put in train some thought that, you know, with a lot of these species, there must be those which are very host specific to birds and mammals which are going extinct or have gone extinct, or even to plants that are highly threatened or extinct as well. And some people have actually worked out then the sort of rates of coextinctions are likely to occur. They're not actually as high as what one might expect, and that's largely because there's much less host specificity, particularly for insects on plants, for example, than we might have imagined 20, 30 years ago. So I'm now picking back up on some of the arguments that other people have made here. The species extinctions due to loss of tropical forests appear to be much less than people had originally thought 20 to 30 years ago. And I think part of that was because when they were doing those calculations, they basically assumed that these areas were being cleared and that it ignored the regeneration. It also assumed that the non-vertebrates, the insects and so on, the vertebrates, the fungi and so on, were as equally threatened and equally vulnerable as the vertebrates, and that's not so certain. More important, there appears to be this thing called a relaxation period when you do have these contractions in forest areas, but you don't get immediately the loss of species that you might have expected to occur. And what we don't know very much about is just those relaxation periods and whether there are major differences for different kinds of organisms. And in that sense, is the forest regrowth that Robin was talking about and Greg, is that regrowth faster than some of those relaxation times? In other words, do we have some buffers for some of these species for them to be retained? Okay. Couple of minutes, okay. Finally, I'm just going to move on to a couple of things. This is some more information similar to the stuff that Robin was putting together, which is about different kinds of organisms and how they're affected by changes in tropical forests. Now, this was a massive experiment I and a number of others carried out in Cameroon in the early 90s. When I say massive, you're dealing with very large areas of forests that you're manipulating in different ways. It took many years to actually prepare, and many years to sample, and then many years to actually sort the species afterwards. What we were looking at is a range of different forest types, and then a range of different organisms to see what happened to them. And if I go back up here, that red arrow going down the side on the left shows the from the pristine forest then right down to the most affected forest, most cleared forest. And on these plots here, it's the same arrow there from the left-hand side, the near primary forest, right through to cleared forest on the side. What we found in these different groups of organisms is that when we tried to make correlations across them, we found that no single group was an indicator for another. There were very few correlations. Butterflies were not a good indicator for birds, and so on. And I think that's one of the major problems that we have at the moment. Typically, people use butterflies or dung beetles as indicators, as token insect groups, thinking that they're representing the insects. Well, they're the giants of the insect world. They're not typical at all. I'll put this slide in here because this is some work I've recently done. Cyclone Larry, a Category 5 cyclone, hit Cairns, where I was living a couple of years ago, devastated the forest there. It was a very frightening experience. We had some before experiments on insect diversity there and afterwards, and a year after, the samples were very similar to the ones before. So the insects are very resilient indeed. So one of the things that I'm concerned about, and I think this is important for science, is that there really are few studies that demonstrate the validity of using a particular non-vertebrate taxa as an indicator or predictor for other groups. As I said, some of the groups are token ones that people tend to use. In general, there's been a lot of very poor experimental design, low-cost projects because the funding has not been so good, and therefore there's a difficulty in extrapolating those results into a global context. And we need to take more of a shopping basket approach. In other words, looking at a range of organisms. Got 2 more slides or 3 more slides, if I may. Okay. What I want to draw attention to is that one of the things that we haven't really considered very much here is, do some of these threats actually act together? Are they working synergistically? Or do they work in independence of each other? I'm not going to go into that into detail now, but the right-hand scenario here shows where we've got some of these things like climate change, habitat loss and harvesting acting synergistically to create more extinctions than we previously thought. So in summary, a lot of global extinction rates estimates, which we currently still use, are based on those species-area relationships which we know don't appear to work. At least they don't appear to be working at the moment. The loss of that change of habitat doesn't automatically translate into species extinctions. Global extinctions are much rarer than widely thought. Currently, they're mostly confined to islands and a phenomena of vertebrates. Extinction threats vary for different taxa, and some groups may be much less threatened than others. And coextinctions are also probably rare. However, and Joe's going to talk about this a bit more, I think climate change will change all of that this century, and it'll certainly tip the scales in terms of massive extinctions in this century. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nigel, for that provocative talk. We're out of time for questions now, so I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and take a break, and then when we come back to the debate, there may be other questions. So there is a coffee break ready in the Atrium Cafe, so if you want to go up the 2 doors, stretch your legs, and we'll come back in 15 minutes. Thank you.